across the country that were previously unsuccessful. In fact, a number of the attorneys were there last night and had a chance to talk about our report and how it's helping them. So the evidence outlined in the report has been very helpful. We're also exploring additional legislation to ensure that we can help protect girls and women from this kind of exploitation. So I'm hopeful this film will give the women today to ensure that Habitat for Humanity and affiliates of theirs and other nonprofits like them can receive donated appraisals on the homes that they build. This removes an unnecessary obstacle to their mission of helping the homeless. This comes out of Dodd-Frank. The Dodd-Frank regulations, I think, inadvertently have required them to pay appraisal fees they didn't previously pay, and it's adding to the cost of every home and keeping Habitat from being able to do more to help low-income families. At a time when we need more affordable housing in Ohio, the last thing we want to do is have the federal government have regulations that don't make any sense that keep Habitat and other groups from doing their good work. I'm a big fan of Habitat, as some of you know, continue to be involved with them and to help them, and I think this legislation is another way we can help. I also introduced bipartisan legislation last week on the steel industry. It's called the Steel Industry Preservation Act. This came after our last conversation, but it has to do with ensuring that the steel companies in Ohio and steel workers receive a fair tax credit for domestic production, which will lower the cost of steel production and promote job growth within the industry. This again was with Sherrod Brown, as we've introduced it before, and we hope we can get that as part of whatever tax reform eventually comes about. As you know, the Senate also voted today to confirm Betsy DeVos. I voted to support her, as I announced I would last week. I supported her because, contrary to some of the misleading attacks about her, she has made it very clear that she'll be a strong advocate for our kids and for our public schools. She's also be like as Secretary of Education. I'm a leading advocate of career and technical education, CTE, and I was pleased that during the process she committed to make CTE an important priority, which is something that we need to do, including reauthorizing the Perkins Act, which she agreed that she would promote at the federal level. She's also made it clear she's going to enforce the Individuals with Disability Education Act, and as she said, protect the hard-won rights of students with disabilities. I also agree with her we can do more to make college education more affordable. So I know this was a controversial nomination, but when I actually got into the details of her positions and her commitments, I believe she's going to be good for Ohio. Finally, as those of you who have followed me in the past know, and as was the case, by the way, with President Obama's nominees, I do believe that presidents deserve considerable deference as they put together their teams. And I made this point when I was one of a handful of Republicans to support Attorney General nominee Loretta Lynch, for instance, or one of two Republicans to support Mel Watt for Federal Housing Authority. And I think that's important that we give presidents some deference to be able to put their team in place. On the issue of Russia, we had a hearing today on this topic. There were some comments earlier this week from the President that seemed to suggest that there was a moral equivalence between the United States and Russia, and particularly our political systems. I find this troubling, and I believe that there is a clear distinction between the way we operate here in this country and the way Russia conducts itself. They have a long history in Russia of eliminating their political adversaries. They've invaded Ukraine. They've annexed Crimea. They just tried to influence our election process. I don't think there's any equivalency there. So this country continues to be a beacon of freedom for those around the world and has to continue to be. And there's certainly no moral equivalency between the way Russia conducts itself and the way the United States does. I've made it clear that with regard to Russia, I don't believe we should lift the sanctions that are in place without addressing the underlying causes of the sanctions themselves. And among those, of course, would be the annexation of Crimea. We had a Foreign Relations Committee hearing this morning, and we had some national security experts there. I questioned them about this. They dismissed the value of developing a counterterrorism partnership with Russia and using that as a way to come up with a grand bargain to lift sanctions. And I agree with them. I'm glad that they were there to assert that such a grand bargain deal with Russia would be passed the United States. They agreed we should keep the sanctions in place unless and until the underlying reasons are addressed. So I hope the administration is listening to that, because in the Congress here, I think we have bipartisan support to ensure that we do, in fact, keep to our commitments to Ukraine, and keep to our commitment to not lifting those sanctions unless the underlying causes are addressed. The heroin epidemic is a huge problem in our state, as you know, and this past week I spoke on the floor about that, but I also spoke about some progress that we've made just in the last few weeks. One is that we now have grant programs that have been implemented for drug courts and veterans courts, treatment programs, recovery services, other diversion programs that serve as an alternative to incarceration. So the CARE legislation, which is the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act, is now beginning to be implemented. I'm very pleased to see that, and this will be helpful for Ohio. I'm also pleased that the Department of Health and Human Services is expanding medication-assisted treatment options by allowing nurse practitioners and physician assistants to prescribe medication-assisted treatment. This is a big deal in Ohio, and a lot of our providers are happy to have this change. This comes out of the CARE legislation as well. And then late last week, we received word that the CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, is now working to limit the prescription of opioids in Medicare Part D. That's the prescription drug part of Medicare. This is really important because we all know that overprescribing is one of the ways this epidemic got out of control. So, as I talked about on the Senate floor last week, our work on this issue continues, but we are making some progress. In the next couple of weeks, we'll be introducing our legislation called the STOP Act, which will build on the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act by helping stop dangerous synthetic drugs like fentanyl and carfentanil, these synthetic forms of heroin. So more on that in the next week or so, and let's get to your questions.
You seem to be pretty shocked. This is Jack Torrey. You seem to be a little bit shocked at what the president said in the Bill O'Reilly interview. I mean, have you ever heard of an American president make such a equivalency between these two systems?
Well, I found the comments troubling, and you know, as I said a moment ago, Jack, I disagree with them. I don't think that there is a moral equivalence here, and that's based on a long history of the way Russia treats its political adversaries, killing them, which was kind of the point that O'Reilly was trying to make. But also their actions in Ukraine, their actions in Syria most recently, their actions in annexing Crimea the first time. Understand the distinct difference, and that America continues to stand as a country that promotes freedom and opportunity, and that's not the way Russia operates.
Senator Tim Miller, WTOL in Toledo. Nice to talk to you. As far as the Betsy DeVos confirmation, there's so much opposition, as you know, for her. How much did you hold into account the feelings from teachers and parents, and even some letters that were handed to you from our school board president in Toledo? And also, will you and your Senate Republican colleagues hold her accountable for her decisions?
Yeah, well, look, I appreciate the input from all of my constituents, both pro and con, and as you know, I got a lot of input on this particular decision. I do think it's important when you're in my role to do your own research and to ask the tough questions and look for the answers that are consistent with promoting public education, but also promoting innovation in our schools. And look, she has a strong record of supporting kids. She's put a lot of her time and effort and her own funds against that effort. But she also made it very clear in her nomination process that she is a strong champion of local control. And one thing I've said to some of my friends in the who are school teachers who have talked to me about this is that there are concerns, even if they were true, and based on her comments, I don't believe they are as to her wanting to provide more choice from Washington through vouchers or something like that. That's not consistent with her strong support and consistent support over the years of local control. In other words, she doesn't believe that Washington or she should be imposing her views on our state or my school district or yours. And said, you supported Loretta Lynch. Now you're saying you can't support this woman who, has this devotion to education and our kids, and has said all the things that that you'd hope she would say in terms of supporting public education and so on. And it was an interesting point. The point was that I did ask the questions, I did get the answers, and I did listen to my constituents and continue to, of course. In terms of going forward and holding these cabinet members to their commitments, absolutely. That's our job, and it certainly will be something that I will do with regard to her as the Secretary of Education, but frankly also with regard to other nominees. And again, I didn't agree with Loretta Lynch on everything, but I did believe that a president should be given considerable deference as to who they put on their team.
Thank you.
Senator Brian Duggar, the Toledo Blade, how are you?
Hey, Brian, good. How you doing?
Hey, good. Can you expand on the STOP Act a little bit, why you think that's an important tool for law enforcement?
Yeah, and I would ask you to talk to law enforcement too, Brian, the folks who are dealing with this every day, that DE is a bigger problem. You know that in your town, in Toledo, we've seen some overdoses that were from what the police would call bad batches. Often that has been a mix of fentanyl or carfentanil or U4 with heroin. And U.S. mail system, rather than FedEx or UPS or another private carrier, because the mail system doesn't require packages to have information as to where it's from, what's in it, and where it's going, whereas these private carriers do. So all we're saying in the legislation is that with regard to packages, we need electronic data that is provided in advance as to where the package is from, what the contents are, and where it's going. And
thank you very much.
Senator Portman, Craig Mickey from WCPO in Cincinnati. How are you, sir?
Hey, Craig, good.
Two questions here quickly. Two different bills have been introduced. One that would terminate the EPA. The other just introduced that would terminate the Department of Education. Do you support both of those bills looking forward?
No, I don't. I think both have a role to play, and having said that, as you know, I'm a big fan of regulatory reform, particularly with regard to the last 10 years. If you look at the major regulations, EPA has taken the lead. So I can send you that information. I gave a talk about that this morning to a housing group because they're concerned about the overregulation. So I think these agencies have a role to play, and they should not be eliminated. But I do think that regulatory reform is appropriate, and I think there's a chance of us doing that on a bipartisan basis. My legislation is called the Regulatory Accountability Act. It's always been bipartisan. It's gone through the House now 6 times. 19 Democrats in the House supported it at one of those times. That was the high water mark, I think. And so even in a partisan atmosphere, we've been able to keep some bipartisanship on this regulatory reform project. And we want to introduce that legislation soon and try to help provide an EPA that is more responsive to both environmental protection and job creation and a growing economy.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you guys very much. Let us know if you have additional questions.